this side by side, you see we have 2 deletes, we have 3 gets, we have our post and our put. Now, with Swagger, this is really cool. So if you have Swagger installed in your web service application, not only does it give you a definitions page to where you can come in and actually look and see how the API works, which eliminates the need to really go back and know what the code does. Because in most web service integrations, you're going to be provided this API definition, but not the actual source code. So you really don't know what's going on behind the scenes, what type of technologies they have running, if it's C#, Java, PHP, Python, you have no idea. But what you do have is a definition. And you know that using the HTTP request methods, you can actually call this API from your application. You can call it from whatever language you want to call it from. You could also call it from web services, a standalone application, or even a mobile application. So with Swagger, it defines our APIs for us. But what Swagger also gives us is it gives us the capability to test our APIs directly from this interface. For instance, if I come down here to our Get API tutorials, if I expand this out, it gives us the definitions we need to interface with tutorials. So here we see we can pass a parameter title, and we should get back a response of 200. We will also get back some type of JSON. So it gives us our example output here. But what's really cool is if this output ties to like a DTO, an entity bean, or some type of object, you can click the schema, and then you can actually see what this JSON structure looked like. So it's going to be a list of tutorials. And our tutorial contains our ID, our title, our description, and published. So now you know what type of Pojo to build on your side if you want to map this JSON object using something like Jackson or a JSON map. So you don't have to actually work directly with the JSON. You could actually work with an actual object. The other cool thing about Swagger is you can actually test directly from Swagger. So I can hit try out. And since title is optional, we can just click the execute button. And this basically acts like a web form. So we just did a get call to localhost 8080 API tutorials. And we also passed in the parameter to accept any type of response. Here's our request URL. So for testing purposes, this is the URL we want to test with. And here is the output. So we see we got our 2 records. We got our calculus, math, true, and we got our second record, how to introduce testing into the development lifecycle, our description, and false. You can also download this, and it also gives you the response headers. So for testing purposes, you want to make sure if you have to pass any data in a specific format, JSON or HTML or XML, you in your request header may have to pass a different context type. So if we were to take this and open up, say, Postman, we could do this exact same test from within Postman. So in Postman, if I just create a new request, paste in my URL, I do a get, my headers don't need any specific headers or parameters, authorizations, or body, and I just click send. And as you can see, we get the same output. Now, what's neat with Postman is if we go to our console, if we expand out on the console, we also see that we get the exact same information that we can get from within Swagger. So we have a request header, response body with our JSON. If we had any request context, we could pass that as well. And it gives us some additional network information. The reason I'm showing you both cases is because from RestAssured, and Karate, we get the same information. We can parse this, we can test this, we can build this. All this is provided within those libraries. All right, so let's go out to our test case. So in order to use RestAssured, it's actually pretty simple. So once you have the library installed, you just simply start typing RestAssured dot. And now we have a whole bunch of different configuration methods that we can work with. So for testing purposes, we want to, so it's actually, RestAssured is actually kind of built using the behavior-like syntax of given, then, assert, body, you have response, you have status code. So basically, most of the typical behavior-driven testing, given, when, then, is how you define your RestAssured calls. And what's interesting is RestAssured uses their chaining method approach to apply everything in one single line. So you could actually do everything in one call. So we can do RestAssured dot given returns us a request specification. So we need a given, we can pass parameters, we can pass in headers. So we'll start with given. And we'll kind of break this out so it's easy to read. So we got given. Now, for our test purposes for this example, I also want to implement the log feature. So if I use the log method, it will get the request log specifications, and I can specify the type of logging I want to write out to the console. So you can actually write out the cookies, you can write out for testing many different components of the request header or of the request itself. I'm just going to use all so we can kind of see everything that comes back. So we have that. Next, we need to have our URI. So what I need to do here is I need to call the method base URI, and this provides the host information for our API call. Now, since we're using one particular API for everything, we can define a public static string, and we can just use URI, and we can set it equal to HTTP localhost 88. So we'll take our URI and we will drop it into our base URI here. So now all of our calls will use the base HTTP localhost 8080. What's interesting about using this approach is you can define environment variables. You could create an environment JSON over here, and inside of your test, you could pass in the environment variables, be it QA, dev, prod, and then go read that JSON value for the host from your resource versus hard coding this into your application. So now we get away from that test-driven development and behavior-driven development and get more into that hybrid approach using data-driven development. So we have base URI, and we know the context type. So the first one we're actually going to do is we're going to create the tutorial. So this is actually let me jump ahead a little bit. So let's actually retrieve all tutorials. So let's actually do the second one first. Only reason I want to do the second one first is because it's a very simple call. All right, so if we do the second one, which is retrieve all tutorials, and we'll code it. So in here, we're going to do that get call. So we need to call the base URL. We don't need the context type in this case because it's just a simple get call. So we have given, we're setting our logs, we're setting our host. Now we're going to do when. So given our URL, when we get, so now under when, you can do when, accept, body, cookies, delete. So under when is where we set all of our headers, our form parameters, and we set the specific HTTP request type. So in this case, we're going to do get, and we need to specify the API. So now API. All right, so now we have our given and our when. Now we need to follow that up with then. So given our host, given some setup, when we want to get a API, maybe pass in some parameters, some context, set some headers. Then what do we do when it comes back? So then we can log our response. So we have our log. So that under given, we're logging the request. Under then, we're logging the response. Log all. So if I leave it here, this will run. It will retrieve the JSON and just write it to the logs. However, I kind of wanted to add one additional step here, because we know from Swagger, when we call this guy, when we call this get or API tutorials, we are supposed to get a response code of 200. So what we can do here in our then, we can then say status code, and we can tell it what to expect, 200. So if we do not get 200, this step should fail. So if I save this, all right, so we have our Spring Boot test, we have our test method order, and we have our second test to retrieve all tutorials. So to run this, all we have to do is go to our class over here on the left or within the code, right click, run as, JUnit test, and in our console here, it will start a Spring Boot microservice for our test case. And in our window, in our JUnit window, it called RestAssured demo application test, and it called retrieve all tutorials, and it passed. So let's go look at the actual log and see what we got in the console. So in our console here, it started our boot, it deployed our test, it ran our test. So it reset Spring Boot, it defined our calculus and our books. So then we ran our test. So our request method was get. Our request URI was localhost API tutorials. We set no proxy. We had no request parameters, no query, form, or path parameters. Our header was accept all. We had no cookies, multi-part, or body. We used HTTP1 to receive 200. And the response came back as JSON. And we wrote the JSON that came back. Ironically enough, this looks identical to what we see in both Postman and in Swagger and in Postman. So real simple, real clean, real easy to follow. So if you're already using Java, RestAssured really does seem to be the way to go. It's real clean, real straightforward. All right, so that's just retrieving the tutorials. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. We have a given base URI. When we get something, then check the status code. Now, what's cool about this is if you look at this last part here, so if you do RestAssured given, and then you follow all the way down to then, it returns a valid response. So this guy actually returns a response. And it will be an IO RestAssured response class. There we go. So this returns the response. And then from your response object, you can do return, you can do pretty print, you can get the status code. So you can now do everything that you can also do here with the chaining of methods. what's nice about this is this gives you the ability to expand upon the validation that you can't do with chaining. So you could do something like get body dot as pretty string, and you can print that out. Or you could take this and map this to an object. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So for now, let's just put this back. All right, so let's go back up to our first test. And now let's try to create the object. So when we do the create, let's go look at Swagger. So let's look at creating a tutorial. So to create a tutorial, we need to do the post request here. And here in Swagger, it tells us, oh, okay, our request has no parameters, but it requires a request body of application JSON with the schema of our tutorial. So we have to pass it in a ID, title, description, and published. Now, since we're in our actual application, this makes it simple because we can just reuse our entity bean. Now here, the response will also come back as just the tutorial. So it will show that it was created. All right, so let's go look at how we do this. So we have RestAssured, we have given, we have base URI, but we need to set the context type in this section here to match what we saw in Swagger. So here, our context type needs to be application JSON. Okay, application JSON. So this matches what we have in Swagger. And we need to pass in a body. So now we have our body. And we need to give it an object. Now this object, from looking over here, needs to be a tutorial object. So we need to pass in a tutorial JSON. Well, since we know the schema and we're already in our Spring Boot application, we can just cheat and reuse tutorial. So here we can do new tutorial. And we can use the constructor of tutorial to set the title, description, and if it was published. We have Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, space travel, and it is published. So we have set our context type to application JSON. We're setting our body. We're using new tutorial, and this will create our entity bean, and it will also set it to JSON when it passes it up. It'll convert our object to JSON. Really clean, really straightforward. Code is not cluttered. All right, so we have our body. So we've essentially now set up in the given everything we need to do to submit the information we need to the call. So next we do when. So given all of our setup, when. Now in here, let's look at Swagger again. So we see here, this has to be a post request. So now we're going to do post, and our post needs to be the API tutorials. So we come back over here. So we see post. Here is our post API. So API tutorials. We now have our header. We have our when, and we are doing a post. Then let's log what we get back. Let's log everything. And again, let's check for status of 200, which if we look at Swagger, that's what we should get from our post. So post, our parameters, we need a body, and our response should be 200, and we should get back our JSON object with our record ID. So let me save this, and we will rerun this.